Fantastic. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining in today. My name is Jeff Abramson. I'm a senior fellow at the Arms Control Association and also director of the Forum on the Arms Trade. The Forum on the Arms Trade is a global network of experts who work on strengthening public efforts to address the humanitarian, economic, and other implications of arms transfer, security assistance, and weapons use. Where about half of us are based in the United States and the rest not in the United States. In total, we reside in about 20 different countries. And I will share a little bit later in the chat a link so you can find out more about the forum. As I mentioned to those who got here early, the chat and Q&A functions are all working. I'm running them behind the scenes, so I might get a little distracted, but do feel free to use those. This is actually probably the second event in a series. We held one also on May 20th with the Stimson Center on U.S. arms sales in the time of COVID-19. Clearly, this moment in history is one that's not just about arms sales, but the issues around conflict and the issues around the flow of weapons are getting a great amount of attention and are widely recognized. We've seen this again this week as the UN has started back up with Secretary Gutierrez again issuing a call for a global ceasefire that he started way back in March. I think many of us recognize that in order to address conflict areas in a time of COVID, the influx of weapons, the continued conflict would just make that much more difficult. And he mentioned that now 180 states have endorsed that global ceasefire, but also so has civil society. And I want to share a link in a minute, a call from civil society signed by over 250 organizations about COVID and the time that this is now in terms of really rethinking how we define security around what is needed for humans. That could mean a decrease in investments in war and instead expending resources towards helping people more directly, as well as other ways to really make sure that people who are impacted by conflict are part of solutions moving forward. That's at a global level, but obviously in the United States, there's also been a great awareness during this time of the impact of the use of force and the use of weapons. That has been seen in some ways in what's happening, unfortunately, in the repression of protests, or more even in just how police forces are using weaponry. There's been, I think, attention that we've never seen before on the 1033 account and how weapons that were once used in more of a military setting have now filtered into domestic uses. This week, we've also seen in the news concerns that perhaps some of the COVID expenditures that are supposed to be directed towards assistance and PPD and other things may have been repurposed to keep the defense industry going. They've been very clear about the CARES Act use and hundreds of millions of dollars to keep that industry going. And this government has clearly made the defense industry a key portion of its definition of what's needed in the economy, as well as in the international trade. So now moving to talk a little bit about the international trade, which was the frame for this event. During this time of pandemic, I did a quick look at the Forum's resource, which tracks foreign military sales notifications. So this is just a slice of what we can see publicly. This year, this calendar year, there's been about 53 billion in notifications. 42 billion of those have come since the end of March. So really since the COVID pandemic has closed down a lot of what's happening. Half of that, more than half of that, was the Japan F-35. So a lot of these have been in the works, but we've also seen attack helicopters to the Philippines and machine guns to the Philippines, over 4,500 MRAPs to the UAE, arms sales offered to India, Hungary, and Egypt. A number of countries where there could be severe concerns about how those might be misused in civil rights abuses or against their populations. This demands attention, and that's part of why we're meeting today. I also wanted to quickly flag some work that may not be as well known that came out earlier this month from John Lindsay Poland on the way that semi-automatics and handguns are now being exported. There's been a change beginning in March that the Commerce Department is now in charge of that rather than the State Department. And we've seen a real explosion in the number of semi-automatics sold around the world just in this period from March to July, including 28 million of semi-automatics to India, others also to Thailand and Oman. There's also been a spike in handgun sales, including to Thailand and Mexico. All these are countries where there could be human rights concerns, but none of this now will have congressional oversight. The change to the Commerce Department means that there are no longer required notifications. that idea of congressional oversight and awareness really, again, came into the news within the last month when the Office of Inspector General report was released, that looking into whether there was actually an emergency last year when there were arms sales declared that needed to move quickly and bypass normal congressional oversight to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. While that Office of Inspector General report found that there wasn't a breaking of the law, it did highlight that many of those emergency sales had not been delivered yet, that over 11 billion in approvals to Saudi Arabia and the UAE between January 2017 and 2019 had been below the congressional notification threshold. There's always some of these sales that we don't have as much insight in, but that number was really astounding to find. Now, obviously, things have continued to happen in these times. And lately there have been the peace agreements or the normalization of relationships between the UAE and Bahrain and Israel. Along with that, there has now been lots of rumors, probably more than rumors, of new potential arms sales, especially to the UAE around fighter jets, as well as around armed drones. Recently, the United States unilaterally redefined its interpretation of the missile technology control regime to make armed drones exports a bit easier. These are raising questions as to whether this is a wise path to take in the time of a pandemic. Is now the moment to be ramping up arms sales? What would be a more appropriate approach? So to have that conversation, which I'm delighted for us to have, we have asked 3 experts who are part of the Forum on the Arms Trade to share some of their new reporting, some of their past reporting, some of the things that are coming up in the way that they are thinking about this right now. I'm going to quickly introduce them and then turn it over. Bill Hartung, who is the director of the Arms and Security Program at the Center for International Policy, has been working in this issue space for decades, has many books, and has been tracking the defense industry, arms sales, and he just this week released a new report on the Middle East Arms Bazaar, top arms suppliers to the Middle East and North Africa from 2015 to 2019. After Bill, I'll ask Jodi Vittori to give her insights. She is the U.S. Research and Policy Manager at Transparency International's Defense and Security Program, as well as a non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She's been writing with both those hats recently in the last couple of years, especially around arms sales to the Middle East, and including the corruption angle and the corruption concerns that occur with those. Jodi has some unique insights into this. She served in the Air Force, advancing to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, and served overseas in Afghanistan, Iraq, South Korea, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain, and was actually assigned to a unique counter-corruption task force within NATO. So many insights in there. Then finally, we're going to turn it over to Dan Mahanty, who is the director of the U.S. program at the Center for Civilians in Conflict. Dan has been working on many of these issues and will have some insights on what the executive and the congressional branch can do, and a little bit of a preview of a report that's coming out between CIVIC and Stimson in a couple of weeks. Dan has a number of additional unique insights from having spent 16 years in the U.S. Department of State, where in 2012 he created and led the Office of Security and Human Rights in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, or DRL. With all that, I would love to turn it over now to you, Bill, for a little bit on what you're seeing, especially in those new reports, and how to think about this in these times.
Well, thanks, Jeff. I want to thank the forum, my distinguished panelists. I'm honored to be on this panel. And I should just underscore the forum's a unique organization, very valuable, and you should definitely consult their website for all kinds of resources on breaking issues on the arms trade. So I'm going to go over my report a little bit. It covers who are the major suppliers to Middle East and North Africa, a little bit about the consequences of those sales, and some discussion of what might be done about it, although I may shorten that because there'll be some further discussion of that by the other panelists. So most of the combatants in the Middle East wars don't produce their own weapons, or at least not some of the sophisticated weapons that are being used there. So imported arms are fueling these conflicts, and without them, they could be much diminished. In this report that I did, I used numbers from the Stockholm Peace Research Institute's arms transfer database, which cover major arms supplies. So it's combat aircraft, helicopters, combat ships. It includes artillery, precision-guided munitions. It does not include small arms. So that's another area that needs further exploration. But the nature of these wars is such that There's a lot of air war. There's a lot of artillery on the ground. So major weapons are perhaps more important in these civil wars than in some others we've seen in the past. The key finding of the report was that the U.S. Supplied 48% of the arms deliveries to the region between 2015 and 2019, which is 3 times what Russia supplied. It's 5 times what France supplied, 10 times what the UK supplied, and about 16 times what China supplied. It's often said China is going to be an important player in the region. I don't really see that, although one concern is that they do sell drones, and some of their drones have been used in Yemen and Libya, among other places. So that's something to keep an eye on. So when these sales are made, the rationales are always they're going to provide stability, a balance of power, kind of be a strategic benefit to U.S. allies and to the region. But if you looked at how they're actually being used, nothing could be further from the truth. If you look at Syria, which is primarily as a result of Russian transfers, although the U.S. has supplied about 2.5 billion in arms and training to opposition forces, so the U.S. is a player as well. But anyway, in Syria, we've seen 5 million refugees, 350,000 people have died, about a third of them civilians, and 13 million people are in need of humanitarian aid. So clearly in this case, the flood of arms from many players has had devastating consequences. Of course, we have a case of Yemen, where the Saudi UAE intervention has killed thousands of civilians through indiscriminate airstrikes, where the overall context of the war, 100,000 people have died, millions are on the brink of famine, they've had their worst cholera outbreak in memory, and they're very ill prepared to deal with COVID-19 because of the destruction of their healthcare infrastructure in the war. We can also look at Libya, where there's a plethora of arms suppliers, and the UAE and Russia have been breaking the UN embargo by supplying weapons to the forces of General Khalifa Haftar, and then Turkey and Qatar have supplied the legitimate government that's recognized by the UN. So we've got all these violations of the embargo, and a small arms survey has found that weapons from 26 different countries have turned up in Libya as part of this war. So that's kind of on the consequences side. Now, who's arming whom? I wanted to go into a little more detail. The US is the top supplier to 2/3 of the countries in the region, including especially the Gulf states. In Egypt, the transfers are split more equally among Russia, France, and the US, so they have a more diversified purchasing base. In Iraq, both the US and Russia are major suppliers, so rather than being dominated by one country or another, Russia supplies about 1/3 of the deliveries, US 45%. And then Syria and Iran and Algeria are overwhelmingly supplied by Russia. So the other thing to consider is that these suppliers depend heavily on the Mideast market. So the UK, France, and US make more than half of their deliveries to the region. Russia and Germany about 1/3. So this is one of the reasons there's such a fierce competition, because it has economic consequences for the supplier states. Jeff has mentioned, some of the recent deals. What I've talked about so far are weapons that are already in the region. So they're available for use in these conflicts. The new offers will take a while to be delivered, but the fact that they're happening at all is kind of endorsement in a way of the states conducting these wars, and I think has a negative consequence on the prospects for peace. But as Jeff said, there's been about 42 billion in US offers since March of this year. So it comes out to about 6 billion a month, similar to last year's total. But last year was one of the biggest sales years ever for the United States. So it's clear that the trade has not slowed down, may have even picked up a little bit during the COVID-19 period. Those weapons also, as Jeff mentioned, are going to some questionable destinations. To the UAE, which has played a role in the war in Yemen, to Egypt, which has had a scorched earth policy in its counter-terror policies, killing a lot of civilians, displacing a lot of people, all with US weaponry. And also in the Philippines, where US firearms and now a possible sale of attack helicopters are backing up the Duterte regime, which has killed thousands of people in its so-called war on drugs, all extrajudicial killings, all questionable as to, they've sort of used the term terrorist drug dealer basically as a way to suppress democratic opposition. And of course, the Abraham Accords between the UAE and Israel have become really arms sales accords because you've got F-35s in the offing, possibly for the UAE. You've got large armed drones. Israel has put forward a counter package of $8 billion that would include additional F-35s beyond what they already have. All this will be hugely expensive. The Israeli sales are normally subsidized by US aid, of which there's a package, $38 billion over 10 years that's been agreed to, was in the late Obama period. If they're going to buy more F-35s and pay for the existing orders, that could easily cost $10, $15 billion, which will eat up a large part of their aid for many years to come. It's already been signaled that perhaps Netanyahu wants to increase that $38 billion, get more aid from the Trump administration to pay for these weapons. The UAE would like to see the deliveries before December, so they don't have to deal with a potential new administration. So that's mostly what I had to say. In addition, my few recommendations have to do with things like in Congress, flipping the script so that major sales have to be approved by the Congress instead of being proposed and having to be overturned by a veto-proof majority in both houses, which has never actually happened. And then also, of course, cutting off sales to Yemen, ideally with the US as the dominant supplier taking the lead and other countries joining in as well, which I think would have a salutary effect on limiting the killing in that country. So I will leave it at that because there's a lot more to hear from the panelists, and there will be much more discussion of what to do about this. So my couple recommendations are just the tip of the iceberg. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Bill. And it's a bit lost in the chat, but I did include a link to that report for people who'd like to check that out. I'd like to turn it over now to Jodi, who can talk really specifically, I think, about the Middle East and some of the additional concerns that come with these relationships, not simply just in terms of security, but also corruption. So Jodi, over to you. Thanks.
Well, thank you. And thanks, Jeff, for organizing this and for everything that the Forum on Arms Trade does, and to all my co-panelists. I want to really highlight today, what are the other reasons that arms sales are made besides the defense of a country? Because I think this is really going to be important as we face the pandemic. There's a need with the worldwide depression that's probably coming, the economic assistance, the public health assistance. This is really the time when Middle East budget should be seeing some shifts more towards their citizenry, particularly when we're talking about UAE, Saudi Arabia, countries like that have put so much money into their militaries already and should have significant stockpiles of goods. I think we really need to understand why those levels of arms exports we continue to see high levels of, and also why we'll probably see that continue, in part to minimize or maximize the ability of these regimes to withstand the popular calls for reform and to rebalance budgets. So one of the, besides just buying something theoretically to defend oneself, and often defense is actually a secondary or maybe tertiary consideration why arms sales are made. One is that these countries use buying large amounts of weapons from the United States in particular, but from any purchaser as a form of security umbrella. It's the combination of the arms purchases themselves make them a commercial interest. The fact that these are purchased by American companies, which means informally these companies become lobbyists on their behalf. These weapons are made in key congressional districts that make these congressional members take an interest in the defense of the Middle East, are really important for Middle East countries to maintain their security with the US. They are small, dictatorial, low population, no significant geography sorts of places that would be very easy to invade. And so they really need that umbrella. Another reason they allow us to use basing as well for the same reasons. It also helps give these countries a pass for some really, really bad behavior. We really particularly see this with the United Arab Emirates, but also with places like Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. Jeff and Bill have done a great job of talking about the human rights concerns, how these weapons have been used in the past, the civil wars, the coercion, the repression of human rights violations. But because they're considered such major purchases of US arms and important security allies in the region, and it's a region that, for 50 plus years has been incredibly important in the United States, they get a pass for some pretty bad behavior. And you really saw that with the Khashoggi killing. President Trump tends to say the quiet things out loud. So he was very clear in saying, why just because you killed a journalist, should we get rid of these arms sales? Normally, presidents wouldn't say that out loud, but it does really exemplify that sort of past behavior. It's also the ability for these countries to get tech transfer. When they set up these co-production sharing agreements that were highlighted, for example, in the GAO report and some follow-on legislation, usually emergency sales don't involve co-production agreements because they're emergencies by definition. These do, and so they allow these states that for many decades have been arguing that they're trying to indigenize their weapons production. It enables that better. Ironically, in the long term, potentially taking jobs away from Americans. But then we really have to look at the corruption and patronage sides of things, because those are massively important in why these weapons trades are made. One is just, the defense industry worldwide is notorious for a high degree of corruption, and has been for a very, very long time. The ability to raise the price on contracts and give those kickbacks out have always been important to various agents, intermediaries, subcontractors who happen to be, the emir's second cousin twice removed or whatever. It's been an incredibly important set for corruption. And you really see that, say, in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia right now. Both countries have really significant scandals going on in their countries right now regarding defense corruption. In Kuwait, it came out after a failed purchase of a Beverly Hills mansion that $160 million at least had disappeared from their Defense Department budget. Part of it was going to be spent for this Beverly Hills mansion, which of course is a questionable defense purchase for the Kuwaiti government. Saudi Arabia, there's a whole back and forth regarding attempted kidnappings and so forth of the former head of counterterrorism and who controlled the counterterrorism finance budget in many ways in Saudi Arabia, who's been very open about saying, hey, I controlled multi-billion-dollar budgets. I was allowed to take my kickbacks for my billions of dollars. I needed to spread those kickbacks around. So we've had this back and forth going on. So you can't negate corruption in these really large contracts. And likewise, patronage. Even if we assume that the contractor itself, the prime seller, is clean, you've got to look at the subcontractors. You've got to look at the offset contracts, the co-production agreements. This is a great way to move taxpayer money or citizen resources or oil rents that should belong to the citizenry through the treasury in the guise of defense purchases, which in all of these countries are very, very opaque, and give them out to favored groups. So who gets the subcontract? Are they key groups that the regime considers important? They might be tribal groups. They might be members of the royal family. Same with who gets these offset contracts. Those are, these are highly secret contracts. They're not published. And that is a great way to have a secret contract with lots of money going to the side to make sure it goes to key favored groups. And at the same time, you're marginalizing those who don't get the contracts. So if you're giving these contracts as a way of providing jobs and funds and so forth to some groups, you're by definition marginalizing others, decreasing their access to resources. And many of these countries use a very us versus them form of dictatorial leadership. So certain tribes are favored, certain tribes or religious groups are deliberately kept to the outside. A very common way for dictatorships to function. Another one I will just highlight briefly is the role that these weapons play in what we call coup proofing. Coups are actually the most common way for dictatorships to change regime. And while we haven't had coups in general GCC countries lately, there have certainly been coup attempts over the past decades. All of their neighbors have had coup attempts multiple times in the past decades. And this is something that groups really look at. So who gets the weapons? They go to key Praetorian Guard forces, key protections of the regime. Other groups get fewer weapons or maybe no weapons for regime protection. Again, linking that patronage with coup proofing. And you get an interesting side to this, which is partly an explanation for why they like to buy so much Air Force stuff. Because frankly, aircraft, there's a lot of kickbacks involved. It's really cool to fly in fighter aircraft. Flight suits are really comfortable. It's like wearing your jammies, which wasn't acceptable. That worked for most people until the coronavirus came around. But you also really can't do coups with aircraft, especially if you can't get a hold of the bombs and stuff if those are locked away. You can bomb the presidential palace. You can't actually take and hold the presidential palace. So there's a lot of reason why Air Force goods are the type of goods, in particular in very shaky regimes, they like to buy. You can't really do a coup with it, and it looks really cool and it's fun to fly. So I just wanted to highlight that there's so much more going on than just the defense sales themselves that we really have to consider when we're looking at these sales coming forward.
Thanks so much, Jodi. I really appreciate those insights, and it's always a great reminder that there is so much more happening. Very quickly, before we turn to Dan, I wanted to ask you, since you have this expertise in the Air Force and in weaponry, if you've had a chance to sort of look at what's been in the offing or transferred lately. Jodi actually was testifying to Congress earlier this year on sort of thinking about the wisdom of arms sales to the Middle East. So I'm wondering if you have any sort of quick insights into the actual weaponry that we're seeing.
Sure. I took a look at the $8.1 billion in sales approved by the Trump administration and that you mentioned with the GAO report and so forth from last year, and compared it to the data from the Congressional Research Service. There were actually 3 prior emergency notification sales related to Saudi Arabia in the past. And you see some really, really interesting things come up when you compare the actual weapons and how those weapons are used. So looking at the prior emergency declarations, and there were 3 of them, one in March of 1979 to North Yemen when they were fighting a civil war with South Yemen. And this was some Cold War politics. Saudi Arabia actually paid for the weapons, even though they went to Yemen. And that's an interesting one because if your argument is Yemen and who's in foreign powers involved in Yemen, that has some interesting parallels to it. 1984 during the War of the Tankers, the Iran-Iraq War, and then 1990 when Iraq invades Kuwait. When we talk about 1979, we're looking mostly at tanks and armored personnel carriers and air-to-air fighter aircraft. And that makes a lot of sense for that environment. In 84, when the fear was maybe Iran was going to go bomb Saudi oil facilities, it was point defense, man-portable air defense systems, Stinger missiles, which also makes some sense. 1990, we're looking at tanks, Bradley fighting vehicles, APCs, Apaches with anti-tank weapons, more air-to-air aircraft, and the Patriot missiles. And again, that makes sense. Kuwait has just been invaded by Iraq. There's really nothing stopping the Iraqis from making a run further south, going further. And so those sorts of anti-tank weapons and so forth, really, I mean, that makes sense in those environments. And this was an emergency. That's why it was set up. So now let's look at the May 29, according to the Congressional Research Service, what was offered. So this is unclassed. I only have what's publicly available like anybody else. And you see some really interesting things. So of this 8.1 billion, 3.7 billion of it, so almost half, go to air-launched precision-guided munitions, Mavericks, Paveway 1, 2, Paveway 2, 3s, and 4s, excuse me, no Paveway 1s, of course, advanced kill systems. And then another 3.4 billion are going for airframes. And of course, these weapons, I'm a former targeting officer, and I've done the targeting and all this stuff for defense of countries in cases. We do use precision guided munitions in a defensive position. If a country is being invaded by a ground force, for example, and you're going to go tank planking or whatever. But none of this actually makes sense for the actual threats that Saudi Arabia or UAE is facing. I mean, if you're going to have a large-scale ground invasion by Iran, you have to go through Iraq and through Kuwait, or round and then all the way over to Saudi Arabia, which didn't go so well in the Iran-Iraq war, I would just note. It's not easy to do, and we would see them coming. Or you could do a large amphibious invasion of, say, UAE and Saudi Arabia. They have a lot of coastline, but Iran doesn't have that capability. And you would see it coming. That's a lot. This is like a U.S. Marine Corps D-Day sort of invasion. It's not subtle to do that. Or we're looking at the kinds of attacks that have really occurred. We've got the 2019 attack, for example, on the key infrastructure for Al-Qaeda and for some of the other oil fields in Saudi Arabia, done by a combination of drones and cruise missiles. We've had allegations of Iranian special forces blowing up ships in the Persian Gulf, and yet you don't see these sales geared towards that. So the rest of the sales, about 5% of the sales, 356 million went to Patriots for anti-missile. That does make some sense, but it's only 5% of the sale. 3% go to intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, which again makes sense if you've got special forces, you're worried about cyber, you're worried about better detection of missiles coming in, but it's only 3% of the sale. There were no anti-aircraft capabilities sold in this emergency sale, which we would presume is how Iran would come in. No anti-drone, even though it was drones that attacked them in 2019. There was no anti-cruise missile. Again, drones, cruise missiles, et cetera. These are the main threat that they have recently faced within the last year. No anti-ship. missiles, if they were going to, come in across the water or send in special forces across the water or something, despite the actual attacks that Saudi Arabia has been under. And then you add the F-35s, the EA-18G Growlers, and the drones, which presumably can be armed now with this change. And you get a lot. This is a very offensive package. Any one of these can be used defensively. But when you take the lump sum of these and you add them to all the other weapons sales that Bill puts out there, it looks really offensive. We've got electronic attack aircraft for going against other people's air defense systems. Well, whose air defense systems are they going against? If you're defending yourself, you shouldn't be taking out someone else's air defense systems. Iran only has MiG-29s. It's not that great of an aircraft, even though they've had upgrades. None of this makes sense from a defensive perspective. It makes a lot of sense from an offensive perspective. And so I would really like to see Congress asking some really tough questions to the State Department, the Department of Defense, on how do they justify this from a defensive perspective? What kinds of defenses are they seeing? Because this looks an awful lot like the kinds of packages of countries going against places with S-300s, S-400s, which starts to look a lot like Iran, Syria, and so forth. They look offensive.
Thanks so much, Jodi. I think you chopped up for a little bit on the end there, but I got the point that this looks like a much more of offensive package than it is in terms of thinking about defense, although those lines are always blurry, as you say. I want to turn it over to our final panelist, Dan Mahanty, to jump back a bit, not necessarily for the Middle East, but at the big picture for how we can now think about the responsibility that we have in thinking about the arms trade. I don't know if I was choppy there, so Dan, let me turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Can you guys hear me okay? Am I choppy or am I on smooth waters?
You're smooth so far.
Okay, fantastic. Well, good morning, everybody. Good morning to my co-panelists. It's a thrill to be up here with you. And thanks to both of you for laying out some really provocative facts that I think will frame a really great discussion. Jeff, want to thank you and the Forum on the Arms Trade. Just to echo what Bill said at the outset, the Forum is doing something that I think is badly needed and that frankly nobody else is doing, to call attention, to kind of bring a set of voices around an issue that gets all too little attention for all the reasons and many more that Bill and Jodi laid out. And to the audience, I know Washington is the place where you sign up and go to events because you usually get a free breakfast out of it, but the fact that you're here without the promise of a free breakfast shows that you're interested in the topic. So I can't wait to have an interactive exchange with all of you and my panelists at the conclusion of this. Well, I'm thrilled to have heard from my panelists. It's always challenging going last because it's a little bit like going to the shrimp tray at the end of like a cocktail dinner when there's nothing left but a couple of the little guys and some cocktail sauce. So I'll try to add something new if I can. And I want to talk a little bit about sort of where we go from here and what we do about it. But I do think it's useful, starting where we did at the beginning of the session, to return to a conversation about why all of this matters. And much of the conversation to this point has been on the effects of U.S. arms sales and kind of the industrial interests around those sales in the Middle East, and for a lot of good reasons. I mean, I think there are probably few issues that have made the headlines more often than the situation in Yemen, insofar as it corresponds with the U.S. responsibility and role that it's played with arms sales to the major coalition partners in that fight, and with good reason those dominated the headlines. But we've also seen headlines, or at least in the news, other stories about U.S. arms sales and the way that they are associated with, as Bill mentioned, human rights, a growing pattern, a systemic pattern of human rights issues in the Philippines. Pictures of U.S. kit being worn by people conducting abuses in Cameroon or other parts of Africa. We've seen issues with corruption and diversion in Latin America, and small arms and abuse by police in Latin America. Benefiting from U.S. provided, manufactured or sold equipment. We've heard stories in the news about American gun manufacturers bribing foreign officials. These are just, and what bothers me, I think, about some of these stories is that they are just today's headlines and today's stories. And when I heard Jodi talking a little bit about the sales that have been made to some of the countries in the Middle East, with no apparent alignment or connection to real needs, it reminds me that, we're not going to be able to know exactly how problematic these sales are until tomorrow and the day after and the weeks and years after. Literally, the world is pregnant with American arms, and we don't have any control or idea of how they're going to be used in the future. in many cases. There are some controls, of course, but I don't want to be overly alarmist here, but I do think it's a story worth telling again and again, that we see U.S. arms being used and involved in conflicts over which we have very little control, and I think have very little interest in being involved. I can tell you, I don't think 6 to 8 years ago anybody said, "Wow, we really want the story of the United States and Yemen to be how we supported the Saudi government's bombing campaign in that country." I think it was something entirely different. And in that way, to me, this conversation is a reminder that really it's worth sort of stepping back and remembering or looking at the fact that arms sales have really become the face and story of American foreign policy in a really problematic way. And during this time of COVID, what better time to ask ourselves, is that really what we want? Beyond even the legacy of the United States relative to Yemen, is the story that we want of the legacy of the United States and its foreign policy during this global pandemic to be headlines around the arms trade. And to me, it seems at minimum inconsistent with what we say we want as the American public, and even as our American policy leadership says. And what's even more, I think, problematic than what we say we want, and the inconsistency there, it's the fact that all the good work being done by the civil servants, the foreign service officers, the government officials, the congressional staff, to do so much good around the world can be undercut by one simple or single event that takes place. All of the good work, even within the same bureau that oversees arms sales at the State Department, also oversees a tremendous amount of good work on disarmament and humanitarian demining, for example. And I think that story is easily lost, when we have situations where American arms end up in the hands of regimes or governments that end up putting them to use for which it was never intended. And we spend a lot of time in Washington talking about whether or not we should be spending more or less on development aid and all the things we can be doing through diplomacy. And I think not enough time talking about how we can do much less harm with just a few more sensible controls on the arms trade, both focused on human rights and corruption. So with that in mind, some of you will recall a couple of years ago, CIVIC and Stimson took a look at what the executive branch could do to take matters into its own hands, to kind of control for those foreign policy outcomes, to adjust its own arms sales policies to better account for civilian harm, to better prevent exacerbating conflict, to better minimize or mitigate the risk that U.S. arms sales would be associated with human rights abuses, et cetera. Because at the end of the day, one of the things we realized was that the most problematic cases that you're reading about actually account for a relatively small proportion of the overall dollar value of U.S. arms exports. And so some sensible controls to weed out the most problematic sales or the riskiest sales seemed like not only a pragmatic idea, but one that would have a lot of effect. And a lot of the recommendations we made, to me, still carry salience today. Jodi spoke about one of the things we recommended, which is making sure that the arms sales were better aligned with actual capabilities needs. That the United States evaluated whether or not foreign governments were able to exhibit kind of prerequisite capabilities before being able to purchase some of the most significant, risky and sophisticated arms. Conducting more rigorous risk assessments, both at the kind of the national indicator level, but then at a sub-national kind of capabilities assessment level based on past performance and the prospect of future problems. Establishing stronger conditions. There's a paradoxical benefit to establishing stronger conditions of use on sale, because it gives you more to go back on in the event that the arms are misused or used in a way that you didn't intend. There are end use requirements that are placed on the recipients, but they're rather flexible, and the language is relatively loose. And I think it makes it more difficult for the U.S. to enforce those conditions when required. And I think one of the biggest gaps in the final kind of major point of emphasis we made in that report, which I think endures as something that's worthy of attention, is putting in place more rigorous oversight of weapons once they're sold. It's very difficult in some ways to do that at scale, but it's something that's incredibly important. Not only looking at whether or not weapons, could proliferate into the hands of competitors, or whether or not the technology can be replicated and pose a risk to U.S. intellectual property, but also looking at whether or not weapons are misused, are used in the in mass casualty or civilian casualty events, and whether or not arms are associated with human rights violations. And we think those recommendations still hold true. The good news is, I think the federal government, for its part, even with all of the bad news, there are some really great civil servants and foreign service officers who have, really put their nose to the grindstone, have made some of these recommendations, none of which we, have exclusive ownership over in terms of our own imaginations. But, we've seen progress made on risk analysis. I think we've seen some progress made, especially through the Defense Security Cooperation Agency on capabilities alignment, looking at prerequisites as a condition of sale. So there have been some benefit, or there has been some progress made, and I don't want to forget that. But we also realized, as we were focused on the executive branch, that at the end of the day, the executive branch, whether it's run by or overseen by a Republican or Democratic administration, the State Department and Defense Department are going to be driven at the end of the day by short-term policy and economic incentives, and to a large extent are going to lack the kind of oversight and balance that, currently lack the kind of oversight and balance from the Congress that might more effectively serve the broader set of long-term interests that are affected by arms sales. That's not to say that Congress doesn't have its own short-term interest, but we feel like there's a certain balanced perspective that's missing, and some controls that would really benefit the overall effects that U.S. arms sales are having. And beyond that, there's only so much that the agencies and the regulatory offices that oversee the licensing and oversight regimes can do without being told to do it by the Congress or resourced to do it by the Congress. So our attention is really shifted towards what Congress can do.
Hey, thanks so much, Dan. Everyone, please do feel free to continue asking questions or putting them in the chat. I've got a few that came in before the call, but Dan, you were starting to talk about what Congress might do, and I know you and the Stimson Center have a report coming out in a week or two, so I don't want you to necessarily give away all the goods, but if you want to just spend a minute or two about what some of those congressional capabilities that you think might be helpful as we think about what's a more proper way to address the arms trade moving forward. And then I would certainly love to see some questions from the audience. We have a group that I'd be happy if people want to ask a question by speaking, I can enable you to speak as well, if that might be more efficient. But let me ask Dan this question about Congress before we do that.
Yeah, Jeff, I'm glad you asked. And again, we do have a report coming out soon with Stimson, and I'm hoping everybody that's on this call will take advantage of the opportunity to come to our own release event where we'll go into much greater detail. But for the sake of brevity, I'll just cover a couple of key points that will be covered in the report, but are also just generally worth making. From my perspective, the conversation within the Congress and relative to the Congress tends to start with a conversation about what's within the realm of the possible based on who's sitting in a particular congressional seat, or which parties holds the majority in either part of Congress, and less about what good might look like, what's within the realm of the possible, what role should Congress be playing. And I think that's where we as CIVIC and the Stimson Center wanted to go with our analysis of this. And so what we've done is we've taken a look at all of the, if you take a look at all of the, the great source, initiatives of certain members of Congress and senators, and you look at all of the analysis that, experts, including many of those in the forum, have put forward, it kind of provides you with a little bit of a blue sky picture of what good might look like in terms of congressional oversight. And so I like to kind of I used to refer to it as in shorthand as kind of our blue sky agenda for Congress, but it's really more like an everything bagel. It's like all of the great stuff that's left over from all of the different initiatives put into one place to give you a kind of consistent flavor. And there are kind of three areas that I think the experts in Congress have focused on that could be put into a cohesive everything bagel. So the first would be really spending some time strengthening the expectations and requirements of the executive branch in the ways that reflected some of the points I made earlier about what the federal agencies should be doing, and imposing a stronger certification and notification regime based on human rights issues and conflict triggers, imposing and resourcing stronger end-use monitoring requirements, and a few other areas of focus. The second really goes to what Bill laid out during his comments, which is giving Congress more power of oversight over the most consequential sales. He mentioned the concept of flip the script, which has been raised and editorialized in a couple of places, including by Annie Sheil and I in the Hill, and by Beth Van Schaack wrote something in Just Security, and Diana Olenbaum also wrote something in Just Security, I think, on what Congress can do. And it's all focused really on giving the Senate a say in some of the most, and the House a say in some of the most consequential votes. I want to make sure I mention at this point that might sound inconceivable or impractical based on the volume of sales that are made. But when you do the analysis and you look at the sales that would be affected by a measure like that, it's actually a really manageable number of sales that would have a tremendous effect and would really put more impetus on the Congress to play a role on the arms sales that are making the biggest difference, or have the potential to make the biggest difference. And then I think the last area of focus where our recommendations will go, and where others have gone before, really centers on a lot of what Jodi laid out in terms of the absence of transparency around the entire industry, around the entire regime of arms sales, making the entire enterprise more transparent through more reporting requirements, greater transparency, more publicly available information, not only about aggregate volumes of sales at a moment when it's too late to do anything about any one specific sale, but also about specific sales, and really more transparency around the financial interests and beneficiaries of an industry that has been touted as one that benefits American jobs, but as Bill has articulately laid out better than anybody, is not necessarily the case. So I think those three areas are the focal points that will be included in our analysis, and where I think there's a lot of room for space to grow. So sorry, I took a little more than 2 minutes there, but there'll be more to come.
I think we never keep to our time allotments, but thanks so much, Dan. There's clearly so much more depth that all of us could go into it. These issues are so thorny and weedy in ways at times, but also so important, because ultimately these things we're talking about are killing machines. They're weapons. They make an impact on lives in so many different ways. We could just open up to talk with each other, but I want to take a few of the questions that have come in. There's a couple in the Q&A, but I want to actually cut and paste into the chat here some that we received ahead of time, specifically on sort of what's happening in the Middle East. I'll put this in there so everyone can see them. These came from a couple of different people, and I will get back to some of the ones that have been in the chat and in the Q&A. But I'm wondering if anybody or all of you want to think about what's been happening now in terms of the Abraham Accords. It was interesting to hear them being called the Arms Sales Accords. I wrote that down from one of our panelists. But what do people think in terms of those normalizations of relationships? Why might there be concern? People who are skeptical about the concerns we're expressing, why might we think that? And are there any possibilities for greater transparency or governance, or do you think it might go the opposite direction? And happy to have others jump in. And as your panelist, as you're speaking, if someone else said earlier in their presentations really flagged for you that you want to make comment on real fast, feel free to do that as well.
Yeah, well, I think, a lot of people feel like, well, what could be bad about these countries recognizing Israel? My concern is, why does it have to be sealed with arms deals? It's on one level, it's a consolidation of an anti-Iran sort of coalition, which, depending how that plays out, could make conflict more or less likely. The other aspect that concerns me is this notion that the UAE would use these weapons to deter Iran, because in fact, they've been, culpable in the war in Yemen. In fact, they've transferred weaponry to extremist militias. Some of it's found its way to the Houthi rebels. Some of the militias have former members of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. So they're not a reliable partner in that sense. And also, they've been very active in supplying General Haftar's forces in Libya, also carrying out airstrikes, drone strikes, and so forth, in violation of United Nations embargo. So I think they're just as likely to use those weapons to interfere and engage in other conflicts in the region as they are to use them to deter Iran in some sense.
Thanks, Bill. Jodi?
I would agree. We don't have the contracts themselves. We don't have a lot of information. I don't have a good connection. But it does, But it does seem, we don't know what oversight there is in the contracts. Building on what Bill said, when it was found that exports to the UAE from the United States had gone to the Houthis and gone to Al-Qaeda associated groups, that should have led to a very, very significant of high-level reviews, congressional hearings, and everything else. I mean, they had the export sticker still on the MRAPs that had gone to these groups that CNN was able to document. The fact that it did not lead to a high level of end-use monitoring, and indeed in 2018, my colleague Colby Goodman has found that when it came to end-use monitoring for the entire Middle East, which Bill has noted is our largest arms export location, there were only 9 end-use monitor official checks. That's, for a place we know there's diversion, for a place we know there's foreign adventurism going on, that's a really, really scary situation. And then there's no end-use monitoring. And now we're going to hand F-35s, EA-18 Growlers, which we've only given to Australia before and a few other places, armed drones. We've got an entire war of the drones going on in Libya between UAE drones and Turkish drones that are literally changing maybe how we see air power used in an unmanned system. And we're about to hand them a whole bunch more and armed. The idea was you'd sell these weapons and they didn't actually use them. Now they're using them and they're using them in overseas adventurism. And so I really think that I don't see any indication that there's going to be greater transparency. I don't see Congress yet standing up to pull back its Article 1 requirements and really giving oversight to what's going out there.
Thanks, Jodi. Dan, did you want to jump in on this too?
No, I think we can probably move on to the next.
I mean, I would like to just make a quick comment on this, in that, this is a region where there is a lot of conflict, and the idea that supplying more weapons in there is the solution, I think, strikes many people at the first glance as the wrong approach. Many other methods and capabilities to ramp down tension in there as well. I wanted to turn to, there's a couple of Q&A questions. Maybe the first one here from Jacqueline around jobs. I know, Bill, your report does talk about jobs. So I wonder if any of you want to take on this idea of, if congressional oversight increases, how might that impact U.S. jobs, or even more broadly, the jobs argument as relates to arms sales?
Yeah, well, I'll kick it off. President Trump, his most exaggerated claims about jobs related to sales to Saudi Arabia. He's claimed as many as 500,000 jobs from U.S. sales there. We looked at the actual flows of money and weapons, and it's probably 1/10 or less of that number. So, and if you add to that the fact that they're trying to, over the next decade, produce a lot of, perhaps 50% of what they buy in Saudi Arabia, the job impact is quite small. I think if you add to that the fact that, as Dan pointed out, if Congress is going to go after problematic sales, those sales are going to be a relatively small percentage of the arms flow. So you're not really talking about that. I think the proponents of arms sales make it sound like, you're going to shut down all sales to Middle East and North Africa. There's going to be huge job impact. In fact, it'll be things like precision-guided munitions to Saudi Arabia, or maybe rethinking the relaxation of sales of armed drones and so forth. So it's not going to be this huge number that are affected, but I don't expect the other side to acknowledge that.
Can I just add a point on this, Jeff? I mean, there's not that much to add, but I would just add a couple of other things. One, for any member of Congress or senator who's terribly concerned about jobs in their own district, I mean, one thing to know is that most of the companies that are involved with selling arms through the FMS or even the DCS process are not, maintaining their commercial or industrial viability through those particular sales programs. Most of the major arms manufacturers are actually, making most of their money somewhere else. As Bill noted, that if you flip the script, what we've analyzed is that and we've actually run some numbers on this, the vast preponderance of arms sales being to countries that wouldn't be affected by the sale would continue really unaffected in many ways, with few exceptions. And so it's really not going to have that big of an impact. And then I think almost in a more, more importantly to perhaps some members of Congress who aren't so concerned about their own districts, getting on board with sensible arms sales controls and at least oversight makes a lot of sense from the perspective of what the American public has said it wants. I mean, we have at least one major poll, I think, from the Chicago Council that came out that that talked about American support for sensible constraints on the U.S. arms trades. And then more recently, there's been polling done, admittedly on one side of the political spectrum, where progressives would much prefer to see their members of Congress prioritize sensible controls on the arms trade. So there's a lot of valid reasons why this doesn't necessarily compromise or place at risk any particular member's political future.
And if I can make one other note more on the macabre side of jobs, when it comes to American citizens, but the same places that have a lot of defense plants are also primary locations for recruitment of U.S. armed forces. And so the same people who are working these defense plants are often sending their sons and daughters to the Middle East, putting them in harm's way. So when the U.S. weapons are diverted and they're used against U.S. troops, those are the U.S. troops getting hit. If UAE and Saudi Arabia were to undertake offensive actions, we would be expected to come in on their defense, say if they did offensive actions against Iran. That's those same sons and daughters from those same congressional districts that have to go in there in the line of fire and do that. So I think there needs to be a broader discussion on human rights, of also looking at just the human rights of the U.S. citizens who would be ending up in those locations and in those circumstances. There needs to be a broader view of what it means to be a job, and who's on the receiving end of some of this stuff potentially.
Thanks. Appreciate those insights. It's always a thorny issue that many of us are asked to take on. So it's great to sort of think through this a bit more. I'm looking at Sam Perlow-Freeman's question. I don't know if the other panelists have had a chance to do that. Let me give you a chance to look at that question. And in a moment, Sam, maybe I'll ask you to just speak your question and frame. But I wanted to, since there's been a lot of conversation about drones, a number of you have raised the prospects of greater sales and this sort of the ongoing use and greater pattern of use around the world and in conflicts. I wonder, Dan, if you wanted to just talk a little bit about sort of what's happening on drones use and sale as might relate to this conversation and thinking about how to do that.
Yeah, and actually I know Rachel is on this call and she's probably done some of the most recent analysis in terms of the proliferation and changes to the MCTR around drones exports. I'm probably best positioned to talk about why it's potentially hazardous that we've seen a proliferation of unmanned aerial vehicles, however you want to describe them, drones, in terms of global security and human rights issues. I mean, I think that there's nothing, a lot of defense officials and people will tell you there's nothing inherently problematic about a drone relative to any other sort of aerial platform that's able to lob ordnance or to conduct surveillance. I think that's worth challenging some of that conventional wisdom a little bit, just in the sense of what these unmanned systems provide in terms of the capability to stay on target for longer periods of time, to extend an option of the use of lethal force as a first resort to governments. And I think most problematically, the legal and policy frameworks that have been applied, basically astride the deployment of drones that provides for the use of lethal force outside of what would traditionally be a conflict environment, a precedent that was set by the United States and followed in suit by a number of our European allies. So there are a number of concerns that attend to the use of drones. We could go on and on about the problems of the use of airstrikes by drones with secrecy and kind of the lack of accountability and the hazards that are involved with that. And I think most problematically in some ways is the trappings of precision and almost humanitarianism that accompany the conversation around drones that make it seem as though this is an entirely benign form of offensive weapon, in which case I think there's a lot of problems with that logic. But I would just call your attention to two of the reports that Stimson Center has put out in the last couple of years, compiled by a group of experts that have talked about both the problematic the risks involved with arms exports and the use of drones, but also a little bit of analysis on the current state of play. So definitely welcome thoughts either from Jodi or Bill too on that front.
Thanks so much, Dan. I'm thinking of some comments on this too, but I'd like to actually invite Sam Perlow-Freeman to, if the technology all works as I expect it to unmute himself and see if he would like to sort of frame his question. I've been sort of a weird way to put this, but I've been really interested as this pandemic times have moved as issue that's been what's happened in the States, and questions about transfer of crowd control agents to the United States, which might be a part of what Sam is asking here. But Sam, why don't I let you frame this, and let's see if we have any thoughts.
Yeah, so this is sort of kind of flipping the script on arms sales. And I mean, we're seeing a totally unprecedented situation in the US at the moment, which is causing me, and I'm sure a lot of people at your end, to be completely freaking out, where a sitting president is actually openly talking about bypassing the public vote to try to steal an election. We've seen we've seen mass street protests and severe police violence against street protests already in the aftermath of the George Floyd killing. And in the event of a challenge transition, a refusal of if the votes go that way of President Trump to lead office, we could see that on a massively huge scale, and with who knows what consequences, what potential for violence following that. It's a really pretty horrific, scary scenario. So in that context, if, and we really hope it doesn't, it comes to that sort of situation, is this something that countries that are not just selling arms or military equipment to the US, but also involved in various forms of cooperative project? I mean, there's such an intertwined exchange of sort of components and subsystems and military equipment between the US and a lot of its partners. Is that something that they can be thinking about, or does it really not make any difference? I mean, I expect the regular military would probably want to keep the hell out of anything that happened. And the US, of course, produces as much capability as it likes on its own for the most part. But are there pinch points? Are there ways in which US allies could restrict certain types of equipment or components that could lead to pinch points? Are there particular end users in the sort of US security force universe that should be of particular concern? On the other hand, are there others that are more likely to be stabilizing forces and likely to be supporting constitutional norms in the event of a contested transition? Sorry, that went on rather a long time.
Sam, I wonder if any of us have thought about this in this way. So I'm going to put the panelists on the spot, see if anybody wants to jump in. And I have a thought, I think, here as well. I see Jodi shaking her head, so maybe over to Jodi.
This is actually in the defense community right now. The civil military affairs experts, particularly, this falls into the rubric of civil military affairs, is a big discussion topic right now. And there's been, I think, first off, I'll just note that there's been some really, I would argue, irresponsible arguments on both sides that are feeding into this. Obviously, the statements by the current administration, and particularly in the last 48 hours, will not pledging to avoid not pledging for a peaceful transition of power, of course, is terrifying. The article in The Atlantic in the last 24 hours about how Republican legislatures in particular could go around the will of their people and the will of the vote, or not count the votes fully, maybe deliberately, obviously are scary stuff. I used to teach American politics and government at the Air Force Academy. I've taught insurgency, Civil War related topics at the National Defense University before I came to Transparency International. And these were always the type of things that were like those wild games that you gave your cadets for like real thinking exercises. but no one actually expected them to be real. And now these are taking up, I will say, a lot of discussion in the United States from a civil military perspective. First, let me frame one thing, and this is where I'm going to get angry at the Democratic side. There keeps being these arguments and statements that the military should step in, which one is bad for civil military issues. You know, if Trump won't leave on January 20th and he's clearly voted out, which is not 100% guarantee, by the way, if you look at various polling and if you look at different scenarios, he actually can win. There are pathways without the popular vote. But if you look at those scenarios, you know, Biden in June put out a tweet that I found incredibly irresponsible, where he said, well, if Trump won't leave on January 20th, the military will kick him out. Okay, first off, that's not a military job. That's a law enforcement job. That is not a military job. If there is a contested election through the 20th of January, the next person who comes forward actually is the Speaker of the House. That is who naturally takes over until it is sorted out. And that will be a mess in court challenges and so forth. So there actually is in the Constitution a manner for transition of power, including if there is a contested election past January 20. And I would argue that all sides need to focus on that. I will say that military, by and large, has been mostly pretty responsible. I mean, General Milley, man, I feel for him. This is such a tough situation right now, because what do you do in that contested election? In theory, you know, you stand by and you salute the Speaker of the House, because on the 21st of January, if it's a contested election, she's the one who, by the Constitution, is the one who is in charge until they sort it out. So that should be the role of the military. But of course, we do know that, you know, there's been a lot of discussion of the role of violence, of stoking violence and so forth. One can go look at, you know, the works of Barbara Geddes and others who work on this for a long time on how these things normally go. From a European perspective, I mean, one is we have more than enough arms and everything in our own country that we really don't need to worry about anybody bringing stuff in. We produce a lot of the stuff. My argument to those in Europe would be to defend your own walls very significantly. Because if the United States falls into a significant level of insurgency or civil war, you've really got to think ahead of what happens to NATO and the alliances. We are already seeing Russia and China playing on the margins here because they know the United States is in significant turmoil. You watch how much Russia is doing these overflights over Alaskan airspace and so forth. China is doing some of these in the South China Sea. If they see the United States is distracted, places like China and Russia and others are probably to be using that. So I would argue that Europe needs to get their act together and up their defenses as they watch the fact that the NATO alliance may be collapsing at that point, and they try to take advantage of that. So that would be my first response, would be they need to watch out for their own democracies at that point, because we've got enough of our own problems. Anything that NATO can provide for good offices, negotiations, et cetera, assistance of law enforcement, et cetera, where it's appropriate, I think is a good thing. But really, I mean, you gotta go watch the Fulda Gap, man, because that's a scary time for Europe itself.
Thanks, Jodi. Dan or Bill, do you want to jump in here?
Well, I'm not sure that turmoil in the United States necessarily will lead to dramatically different global military postures by Russia and China. I'm concerned about their political interference in U.S. elections. I'm concerned about how the U.S. militarization of U.S. policies at home and abroad diminishes U.S. influence in various ways that it could undermine democracy even further. You know, those are the things that I would be concerned about. In terms of U.S. weapons, a lot of the ones that are being transferred and used both in the U.S. and in problematic situations abroad are primarily U.S. components and could be, I think, substituted if needed to keep those flowing. So I don't know if Europe has that kind of leverage in terms of trying to, you know, interrupt weapons flows by not providing components, but I may be missing something on that front. So that's just my initial take, I would say.
Dan, did you want to?
I mean, there's so many different, you know, conversations that could come out of this. I mean, I think it's, I for one will probably sort of avoid the temptation to speculate too much about what we can anticipate happening in the next couple of months. I'm just as nervous as everybody else, and I think I agree with Jodi. We probably have enough guns on the streets in this country, not to mention a growing. It's not even a divide. It's a significant canyon of trust between armed law enforcement and the public in a lot of cities. Not to mention the proliferation of armed non-state groups all over the country in terms of border militias and militias in the north and pro-police militias and anti-police militias. We have plenty of tinder in the country to be set off in unpredictable ways on that front. I do think this whole idea of, what is the story of America's influence in our foreign policy and the terms on which we compete is one that's worth visiting and revisiting to establish an affirmative vision of what U.S. foreign policy should look like. And we talk about the distraction created by the election that allows for Russia and China to exert influence. I mean, I believe, and I won't disagree with that wholeheartedly, but I will say that I think the U.S. has been distracted for the last 20 years and probably beyond that in terms of the way we've thought about the best means by which we compete through the export of arms. Through the use of military force in countries to kind of go after esoteric threats to our national security. Whereas if we were to replace that with a positive vision of how the U.S. might compete in sort of a legitimacy arms race, I think that's probably going to be a much better vision for the future if one's even available at this stage. Because I think spending ourselves into the ground and trying to compete on the basis of arms sales and matching China move for move in third countries is a losing proposition that this country has already sort of played out once, much to the detriment of a lot of people around the world. So just a kind of a meta thought there.
And we might be off on a tangent here, but I want a quick little couple points on this. I don't know sort of what percentage of American weaponry is imported. The U.S. is a very significant importer of handguns, or sort of like small arms in many ways, which come from Europe. There's also, I believe, a lot of co-production now, actually, where European companies are now established shops in the United States. I think it's actually quite valuable for European countries to raise concerns about what's happening here in this country. I think that's in the frame that Dan is talking about there at the end, is what is America's vision for how it relates to the world, how it promotes human rights. It has been really interesting, and I don't think for those in Europe who are doing this, I don't think it's really registered in the U.S. audience that there have been flags about within European countries about whether to sell, I think, tear gas to the United States or other crowd control agents. This doesn't resonate, I think, broadly yet in the United States, but I do think that the protests that happened in the streets of Europe around the social justice issues does get attention in the United States. And I think more broadly, NATO allies and other countries in Europe who are trying to hold a high value around democracy, making statements and positions that reflect to the United States when it is out of step. So here I'm thinking about on landmine policy, for example. So this isn't necessarily arms trade, but Europe came out pretty strongly opposed to the United States thinking about using more landmines. Recently, the European Parliament, in a more symbolic than actual resolution, called for no longer selling weapons to Saudi Arabia because of the abuses in Yemen. Those types of things which demonstrate a better behavior and can relate to the United States, I think are very valuable and helpful. I think the panelists are probably right that there's not actually a weapons flow issue from European countries to the United States that would cut off or be a chokehold. But I do think symbolically and in terms of bringing the United States in line with a more responsible approach to the world, there are ways that can be done. I'm conscious of our time. I don't know, I saw Frank's question, but I don't know if any of us have any insights in terms of potential arms sales to Eastern Europe / Ukraine, but I'll ask the panelists if they do.
I feel like there was a notification within the year, but I would have to look it up, of a sale of some significance.
And there's been some other comments in the chat, which I really appreciated, about thinking about how to talk about these and the terms around them. Is there anybody else would like to send in a quick question or a chat? I'm looking to see the pre-questions, see if there's any we should address, or at this point to thank the panelists. I have one that we received. that maybe is for Dan, but could be for others. When we think about challenging partners that are not recipients of U.S. Weapons, what are some of those diplomatic tools that we could be using? This is, again, I kind of framed the question about sales to the Middle East as the arms should be the last piece of this conversation. There's so much more that should be the first part of the conversation. So I'm wondering if anybody wants to talk about sort of the other tools that could be available. And I think that might be the last one.
I mean, I'm sure we probably all have thoughts on this, given the depth of experience that everybody has. I'll offer a couple of quick thoughts. One, I mean, the most significant tool that we've had, which we've largely wasted away, is any basis of legitimacy and credibility to speak to issues around whether it's human rights or corruption, and getting back to a point, if we ever had it, where we can speak with credibility as a source of power and influence with partners. I don't think we've entirely wasted that away. I think U.S. diplomats and and senior officials still should be calling attention to human rights issues when they see them. But we shouldn't understate the importance of matching our power with our legitimacy when we're trying to persuade others to do something, nor should we overstate the effects that U.S. foreign policy can have in any one particular place, whether it's through assistance or the absence of assistance. But traditionally, you would go down the list of available tools. You could talk about working in coalitions of other countries to establish norms that are expected to be lived up to, and to create some degree of shame around failures to abide by those norms, including accountability, including conduct, including governance. You would look at the economic means at your disposal, should that be a tool that's available to you. And I think you can look at the allure of relationships with the United States, which appeal to some countries and their officials more than others, but it's certainly something that I think holds true in large parts of the world, where relationships and influence and access still mean a great deal. But if you're looking at a place like, China, there are a lot of places where their traditional tools, the means by which we would assume to be able to exercise influence, may not be as available as once thought. And we might actually be seeing the economic ties work, in ways that are not favorable to human rights. I mean, I'm thinking right now of the release of Mulan recently, where, as at one point it was conventional wisdom that improved economic ties and bolstering the middle class would actually, work in favor of human rights. In reality, what it's done is created some pretty significant dependencies by U.S. commercial interests on the middle class in some of these places. So I think it's a tricky question, but one that's worth asking. And the last thing I'll say on this is, a lot of the legislation and even the kind of assumptions around the use of assistance to promote human rights it does suffer from this Achilles heel in some ways. I mean, the Child Soldiers Prevention Act, for example, is tethered to the provision or non-provision of military assistance. But if military assistance really isn't on the table in those countries, then it makes it more difficult to take it off the table. But the sheer act of being listed on the Child Soldiers Prevention Act and being recognized and called out for a failure to abide by an internationally established norm reinforced through U.S. legislation is still a really powerful tool that we've seen work in effective ways, at least when I was at the State Department, but defer to others for their thoughts.
I think Dan did a pretty good job. I'm not sure I have a lot to add to that.
I would only add one that I would like to see more, and that is that I would like to see the U.S. make an effort to require these arms sales to be more accountable to their populations, to ultimately use its leverage that it has by providing the security umbrella for now, to require that parliaments in those countries, which are very weak, they're parliaments name only, be required to have oversight of arms sales and their actual budgets, and that real budgets exist, because we all know, and this goes back to Sam's question earlier, you've got to have civilian control over the military if you're going to have a functioning rule of law country that doesn't blow up every time there's an Arab Spring. The long-term goals should be, how do we create the kinds of governments in the Middle East, or help influence that? We can't create it. Help influence more towards having governments that are actually responsible to their citizenry and their citizenry needs, and less responsive only to their own regime survival. For now, these countries have to rely on the US security umbrella. But I think Russia proved with coming into Syria and saving the Assad regime that Russia can also provide, on a very limited basis, under some circumstances, the security umbrella. And we need to take that into account, that our time of using our leverage is getting really short if Russia can do that more consistently. You pay a terrible price if you're the Assad regime for allowing Russia or Iran to come in. You can do it, and it will save your regime. And I think we need to take that more seriously and use leverage while we've got it to start moving these countries towards reforms that make them less likely to jump ship to, places like Russia or China or something.
I thought of something. I think, no matter how you look at it, U.S. influence is going to be diminished. It's not going to be dominant in the way it was in the post-World War II period. So working with allies and in-house institutions will be more important than ever, I think. And of course, if you have a nationalist regime as we have here, a lot of that goes out the window. The dismantling of arms control agreements, pulling out of the World Health Organization in the middle of a pandemic, claiming that we'll get the vaccine first instead of cooperating with international efforts to cooperatively develop one. There's all kinds of areas, including arms sales, where absent a genuine kind of cooperation, as opposed to a notion that you're going to sort of hammer people into taking your positions, I think will be essential if the U.S. is going to play a constructive role.
Jeff, I know we're wrapping, but I just what Jodi said is so critically important to me. And I mean, it is with every think piece that comes out right now about, restoring the global liberal international order. I think, depending on where you sat during that halcyon era of the global international order, that might not have been such a great thing for you. And we spent so long, basically building the power structures and upholding a kind of security construct that worked for too few for so long. And if we can shift that thinking, this might be a little bit more of a progressive articulation of Jodi's really excellent realpolitik point, but I think it makes a much more compelling vision of the future than one that we imagine occurred in the past.
Thanks so much, Jodi, Bill, and Dan. I'm thinking of what I thought our conversation would be today, and some of the tangents, or not tangents, but the places we went, which I think is a real indication of why the arms trade, it can't be sort of separated out. It is so tied and linked into so much else that it was great to have this conversation. I really appreciate the panelists for doing so. Just a few takeaways. I think a lot of us are talking about some real concerns about the directions of some of what's happening in the arms trade right now, in terms of, especially in this time of pandemic, that there could be better uses for our efforts and better ways to make what we're doing much more responsible and transparent, and especially we need to take into account all the other effects of weapons sales, especially a lot of those that Jodi was talking about around corruption and regime prop up. But at the moment for using our influence is now, and we need to reestablish in some ways. So you'll see recommendations from Bill and his report in it, and also obviously from Dan and Rachel at the CIVIC and the Stimson Center when they launch on the 13th. I'm going to leave the webinar open for a little bit in case anybody would like to download the chat, because the chat actually has a lot of great resources, and I really appreciate all the comments and links that were provided there. But I think with this, I want to thank Jodi, Bill, and Dan for providing their expertise, for everyone who jumped in to attend as well as provide thoughts. This video will be available. It's being live streamed right now on the forum's website. And then we're certainly happy to send some follow-up to you later, and really appreciate everyone's attention.
Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Jodi.
Thanks a lot.